I'm Patricia Van Skyke, and I'm director of the Lloyd Library and Museum. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's artist lecture, Sentimental Science. The Lloyd Library is located in Cincinnati, Ohio, with collections going back hundreds of years, and a goal of bringing science, art, and history to life. Indeed, we are used by scientists, artists, and historians, as well as a wide array of others, especially those with an interest in either nature and or medicine. It's always fascinating to see how our collections inform researchers' work. Shae Warnick spent a month at the Lloyd as one of our artists in residence. As you'll see tonight, she discovered amazing creatures. She will take us on a journey of depictions of animals over time and show us how she incorporated stories, illustrations, and concepts of nature into her artistic creations. Parts of tonight's program were pre-recorded, but Shae is with us tonight, and she will participate in a question and answer following tonight's lecture. But as you heard, as you were coming into the room, feel free anytime during the lecture to send questions her way using the chat function. And we encourage you to select from the drop-down options all panelists and all attendees, or panelists and all attendees. That way everybody in the audience can see the question as well. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the 2020 Lloyd Library Artist-in-Residence, Shae Warnick. Hi, Shae.
Hi, thanks for that introduction, Patricia, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm really excited to share some of my experience at the Lloyd Library with you guys. Like Patricia said, my presentation is recorded, so we'll be hitting play on that in just a second, and then afterwards, you guys can feel free to ask any questions. We'll have a Q&A, and you can ask them during the lecture. I'll keep my eye on the chat as well. So thanks, everyone.
Hi everyone, so I'm Shae Warnick. I'm an artist from Southern Indiana, currently living in Eastern Idaho. But I had the amazing opportunity to be an artist in residence with the Lloyd Library earlier this year in the month of February. It was hands down one of the best experiences of my career so far. The material I gathered, I'm sure, is going to be making its way into my work for decades to come. So I'm excited to share some of that with you tonight. But before I go into what I was researching for the Lloyd, I wanted to show you guys one of the last projects that I worked on before this residency. It's a project that really had a lot to do with what I decided to research and create for the Lloyd Library. The project was called The Aviary of the Reverend William J. Long, and essentially it was an installation with 750 of these objects that I call bird dolls. So these were just hand painted on cloth and then cut out, sewn, and stuffed with cotton. Then in the actual installation, they were arranged together in a row, usually wrapping around a room. They've been installed several times, a little differently each time. And this project was inspired by some research that I was doing into wild animal stories of the late 19th century, where nature and animals were seen in a very sympathetic and anthropomorphic light. And these were books like these by Jack London, Call of the Wild, White Fang, Ernest Thompson Seton, Wild Animals I Have Known, and especially the Reverend William J. Long, his books like Beasts of the Field and School of the Woods. So all of the animals in these books weren't necessarily talking animals. They were written as though they were realistic portrayals, but they were animals with very human-like emotions. So for example, Long's book School of the Woods, it's all about mother animals teaching their children and showing affection. There were a lot of meanings that I was thinking about when I was putting this installation together, but simply put, you could kind of see this whole project as a nature experience once it passes through human perceptions. So this is a way that maybe it would be skewed and ordered. This is kind of showing how our human perceptions are inescapable in our dealings with the natural world, and it kind of questions the ability that we have to really actually ever be objective observers. And so this is what sort of inspired the work that I decided to do for the Lloyd. I knew that when I was working with the Lloyd, I wanted to continue looking at history, searching for ways that our perceptions of nature have changed over time, and just in general, searching for human filters in nature writing. So I decided, instead of looking at every single book that the Lloyd Library has, I would narrow it down to just books about birds, which are my personal specialty, and then also nature books that are geared towards children. So I knew that I also wanted to translate my findings into more toy-like objects, and I'll talk more later about why I choose toys of all things. But in a nutshell, that was my project for the Lloyd, to examine human filters present in children's literature and books about birds, and then I would portray some of those ideas in handmade toy-like objects. So most of my time at the Lloyd, again, it was for a month, about 20 hours a week. That was spent just devouring books, taking copious amounts of notes. I think I have about 90 tiny typewritten pages worth. But what I was really looking for in my research at the Lloyd, I was just looking for stories. You could call them, again, human filters, but more specifically, human filters and stories and supposedly factual accounts of nature. So I wasn't looking at fiction books. Like many of the wild animal stories, these accounts are presented as factual accounts, but the stories, they're still there whether it was intentional or not. A really quick caveat before I talk about my findings with the Lloyd. I'm very aware that the viewpoints that I'm about to give are just a small cross-section of the viewpoints that were had around the world at this time. I know that it's predominantly white, Western, mostly English-speaking, educated, and oftentimes well-to-do viewpoints that I'll be sharing. What I'm about to share with you is mostly British and American between the time period of about 1600 to the late 1800s. I do want to talk about specifically what it was that I noticed they chose to include in their scientific accounts about nature that are very different from what we might find in our scientific accounts today. One of the biggest themes that I noticed very quickly was religion. Almost every book that I read about nature from about the 1600s to the late 1800s had some sort of prominent allusion to religion, and it kind of changed over time, which I'll talk about, but it was pretty much always there. And again, this being mostly British and American accounts, when I say religion, I mean pretty much just Christian religion. And one of the earlier books that I found that was a perfect example was this book, History of Four-Footed Beasts and Serpents. This was originally compiled by Edward Topsell. I think it was written in parts starting in 1607 and 1608 and then compiled later after his death. But this book was a bestiary, so it included pretty much all of the species that they knew to exist at the time. There's a lot of species that we're familiar with, also a lot that we're not so familiar with, that now we know don't exist, but they weren't aware of that then. And in this book, at the very beginning, there are two epistle dedicatories, one written by a man named John Rowland and the other written by Edward Topsell. And in these, they really kind of lay out those religious themes. John Rowland talks about a religious idea that I saw again and again in a lot of nature writing, this belief, an idea that Adam had a knowledge of all creatures in the Garden of Eden, and then it was lost at the time of the fall. So in his epistle dedicatory, John Rowland actually compares this book to sort of like another Garden of Eden or an Ark of Noah. So this was the most complete book on nature up to that point. Edward Topsell in his epistle dedicatory goes even further. He talks about how this book is a divine book, that it shouldn't be slandered. And he even says that books like this, no man ought rather to publish than a divine or a preacher, which he was. And the purpose of books like this, Edward Topsell says it was to bring divine knowledge. So he talks about how God uses animals in visions and in the scriptures. He says, "Doth the Lord compare the devil to a lion, and yet we have no knowledge of the nature of lions? And so all the world are bid to learn the natures of all beasts, for there is always something to be learned in them, and every beast is a natural vision, which we ought to see and understand." So the study of nature was seen as a way to improve morality, and that was a religious theme clear to the end of the 1800s, even into the 1900s. But it was mostly this earlier time period that saw these books as truly divine books. So Edward Topsell saw this as another holy book, so a book that you would read on the Sabbath day along with your scriptures. Topsell says not only the knowledge of profitable creatures is divine, but also the hurtful. So this book was full of just dangerous creatures, sea serpents, dragons, things that could injure, accounts of wild animals attacking people, some really sort of gruesome stories. Again, taken overall, this book was kind of a bleak account of nature, and I noticed that about a lot of the nature accounts from this time period. But the later books that I was reading, this tone really changed. So religion was still a very prominent theme, but it sort of transitioned. Instead of the unknown being who can injure, it kind of transitioned to what J.G. Woods calls the being who can benefit. So no longer this focus on the destroyer, but on the preserver. They saw all of nature as beneficial. All of nature was a witness of the goodness of God. Ideas that were prominent in the Renaissance, things like the Great Chain of Being, which was this idea that all life on Earth, from the tiniest microorganism to God, is linked in this continuous chain. So that idea continued in this era, and it took on a particularly rosy hue. So we kind of have this shift from earlier accounts. They kind of portrayed the world as the lone and dreary wilderness, and now it was very much a Garden of Eden. Along with the idea of the Great Chain of Being, lots of people in this day didn't believe in extinction, including Thomas Jefferson, who believed when he sent Lewis and Clark west that they were going to come across mastodons, giant sloths. It was this idea that things like dinosaurs must still be hiding out somewhere. It took 400 years before people finally acknowledged that the dodo bird was extinct. There were some scientific men at this time who were starting to kind of understand about this idea of ecosystems and the danger that we presented to them. But those ideas still weren't strong enough to overtake this kind of rosy view. In wild and uninhabited countries, one author said that we find lots of carnivorous beasts which prey upon the gentler animals, but then when man takes his abode in these regions, he's allowed to exterminate the beasts of prey because they're no longer wanted. He says that man himself feeding on the creatures which they before were commissioned to remove, so they are no longer necessary. This book was a really good example of a lot of the ideas that were found in the nature books geared towards children during this time period. So you can just see it in the title. So Beauties of the Creation, or A New Moral System of Natural History. Then down here, designed to inspire youth with humanity towards the brute creation and bring them early acquainted with the wonderful works of the divine creator. So books like this promoted the idea that studying nature had a softening effect on the character. And books like this are what led to the creation of bands of mercy. These were mostly in the late 19th century, even into the early 20th century. So these bands of mercy, they usually had these regular meetings. At these meetings, the children would recite this pledge: I will try to be kind to all living creatures, and I will try to protect them from cruel usage. Adults would usually lead these meetings, sort of like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And they would just teach kids lessons about promoting kindness and concern for all animals. Bands of Mercy started in Britain. They came to America around 1882. By the early 20th century, more than 260,000 children, which was about 3% of children ages 5 to 9 years old, were active members in a local Band of Mercy in North America. So there was this idea that Bands of Mercy would hopefully help create a more peaceful and kinder world. People started to become disenchanted with this idea once World War I hit, and then especially once World War II hit. But so the books geared towards children at this time were full of these ideas. You read lots of, bullfrogs pleading with kids not to throw rocks in their ponds. They talk about children riding bears in the forest like hobby horses, knowing that the bear would do them no harm. It was very different from the depiction of bears that we were getting in earlier nature writing. For example, in that bestiary, they described bears as filthy, deformed, cruel, dreadful, fierce, greedy, bloody, heavy, night-ranging, menacing, headlong, ravening, rigid, and terrible bear. So another theme that I ran across reading old nature books was this utilitarian theme. So it seems like a lot of the people who were purchasing or reading these books, they were referencing them for things like how to hunt certain animals, what they tasted like, how they were as pets, their tameability, their medicinal qualities, things like that. So I read so much about hunting animals. I've never hunted before in my life, but I learned a lot about hunting. For example, hummingbirds. You can catch hummingbirds by chewing thickened breadfruit juice till it's the consistency of wax. They used to just stick that to the end of a stripped palm rib, and then the hummingbirds would peck at it and get stuck. I learned about smoking out parrots, stunning birds with blunt arrows, hunting tigers with elephants, or electric eels with herds of wild horses. Along with how to hunt them, almost every early entry talked about what they taste like. I learned that possums were like the suckling pig of the New World. Moose taste like horse. Supposedly, parrots in Brazil that eat the seeds of spice trees will actually taste like cloves and cinnamon. I also read about the taste of just about every bird in the U.S. discovered by this time. So the tongue of flamingos was a delicacy. Curlew was considered one of the most delicious. I also read about the taste of most eastern songbirds, at least birds that were big enough to bother with eating. Although I did read about some priests in Suriname that supposedly were forbidden to eat any meat other than hummingbirds. Nowadays we have the Migratory Bird Act. It protects most songbirds from being hunted. But back in the day, if you went to a market in a big city, say Philadelphia, you'd find strings of our common songbirds just hanging up in the markets. For example, robins, waxwings, sparrows, even red-winged blackbirds, which supposedly taste terrible. I also read tons of accounts about what these birds were like as pets, their domestic characters. It seems like just about every bird they tried to tame it. And partly that was because that's how they did their ornithology back then. They studied the birds by capturing them, putting them in cages and observing them. But I read that cormorants become irritatingly tame. Ruddy turnstones will run around your feet like chickens. I was also really surprised at just all of the different birds that could supposedly be taught to talk, including all of the blackbirds, all of the mimickers, like the mockingbird, the thrasher, the catbird, even the blue jay. So many of the American birds were exported as cage birds. The mockingbird was super popular. There was also the cardinal. They called it the Virginia nightingale. The Count de Buffon talks about a boat that came from Florida to Cuba that was full of cardinals. He says that the Spaniards paid up to $10 a piece for the cardinals, for a grand total of about $18,000. So that would be roughly about $1 million in today's currency. So one of the biggest utilitarian values of anything from nature was its medicinal properties. So birds were no different. Birds were medicine. All animals were medicine. For example, the powder of the teeth of dogs maketh children's teeth to come forth with speed and ease. Whosoever doth anoint his body all over with the blood of a lion may safely and without any danger travel amongst any wild beasts whatsoever. Just one more example, the osprey. Their beaks excel for the toothache, and if you take a beak and you pick your gums till they bleed, then it will cure toothache. So those were just a few of the unusual and sort of fantastical medicinal properties of creatures, but there were a lot of really legitimate medicinal properties. And so that was a huge piece of utilitarian information. I'm sure this was a major reason that lots of people referenced these books. Another theme that I picked up on pretty quickly was this idea of attribution. So a lot of these old nature books, what they were, they're just compilations of lots of things that were written before, or compilations of firsthand accounts of people that these authors came across. Most of this knowledge, it was very much based on, the veracity of the witness. How trustworthy were they? So they did a lot to try to kind of establish their characters. Stuff like the amiable Dr. Jenner, who has since risen to immortal celebrity in a much nobler pursuit, and to whose genius and humanity the whole human race is under everlasting obligations, says, and they would lay out then whatever piece of information they're borrowing from Dr. Jenner. A lot of these nature writings, it almost felt like the authors were members of parliament who were standing up to give their persuasive speeches, not necessarily with facts, but more with stories and eloquence and, whatever tools they could use to sway people. Also, most books, they really loved their anecdotes. Any good stories were kind of rehashed again and again. There's ones that I heard many times. I became really familiar with the story of Sir Hector Munro's son. So he was on Sauger Island with a group of people. They were just resting on the edge of the jungle, kind of refreshing themselves, and suddenly a tiger jumped out of the trees and grabbed Sir Hector Munro's son and dragged him into the jungle, and he was killed. So this was an extremely famous story. It was to the point where if you're reading a book and they're talking about tigers, they don't even have to tell the story. They can just say, the fate of Sir Hector Munro's son is known to all. Similar instances are related. Another story that was really famous that I read a lot, that's worth recounting really quickly, is the story of today they've dubbed it Zarafa the giraffe, but it was just called the giraffe back then. It was so famous that it just went by that name, the giraffe. But it was a gift from Cairo to the new king of France. It was like a diplomatic gift. This was in 1827 and it arrived by boat in Marseille. And then they walked it from Marseille 550 miles to Paris. So people came from all over as this giraffe was parading across France. People left their fields, their farms. They just crowded around it to see it. It was such a spectacle. When it did arrive in Paris, over 600,000 people came to see it. So again, a huge sensation. I read about this a lot. One of the most common, or at least apparent, human filters that I came across, and that probably anybody comes across while reading old nature writing, is misinformation. When I was researching at the Lloyd, I was so glad to have internet access. There were so many supposed facts that I read that weren't true, some were true. Sometimes I felt downright silly Googling things like, is it true that a walrus can walk up a vertical ice cliff by vacuum suctioning its flippers to the ice? I found out, no, that's not true, but they can use vacuum suction with their mouths to suck the entire skin right off of a seal, which is also pretty interesting. I also had to Google, do petrels really contain so much oil that sailors actually used to take them and stick a wick right through them and out their mouths and use them as candles? And I found out that yes, that is true. They have several specimens in museums. I just came across these small statements as facts all the time that now we know are very obviously not true. Like swans don't live for 300 years. Hummingbirds don't come from flowers. Misinformation was so interesting to me during my research. You can learn a lot about a person, a culture, or just humanity in general from misinformation. It's almost like misinformation in history is sort of like a crater where truths puddle. With intentional misinformation, you can ask things like, why are they telling this story? Why are they exaggerating? And sometimes if it's things that they really thought were true, tracing a story like that can tell you a lot. In the bestiary, there are pages and pages on dragons. You can see down here it says that among all the kinds of serpents there is none comparable to the dragon, or that affordeth and yieldeth so much plentiful matter in history for the ample discovery of the nature thereof. So they supposedly had ample information on the dragon at this time, but there was only one small paragraph included about the giraffe. You can see here they call it the camel leopard. They thought it was just a cross between a camel and a leopard. Sometimes I was so impressed by what they were able to discover and learn at this time. And then the next page, there would just be something that to my mind just seems so outlandish and out there and difficult to believe. At one point in this book, The Bestiary, he gives this account, which is one of my very favorites, about this tarantula in Italy. Supposedly, if it bites you in the winter, it's not venomous, but if it bites you in the summer, then he says that the patient is violently ill within hours. Soon the patient will die unless... And then he gives this great account. He says, music be called to his assistance. For at the first sound of the musical instrument, although the sick lie as it were in an apoplectic fit, will at last they get up and fall to dancing with wonderful vigor. It says that they dance for about 12 hours a day for 3 to 4 days, and then they'll be cured of their symptoms until the same time next year. He says that they have to prevent a relapse by music and dance again. Then he says that while the persons affected are dancing, they lose in a manner the use of all their senses, like so many drunkards do many ridiculous and foolish tricks, talk and act obscenely and rudely, take great pleasure in playing with vine leaves, with naked swords and red cloths and the like, and on the other hand, can't bear the sight of anything black. I was also sometimes just really puzzled by accounts that seem like they must have just been outright lies. Maria Sibylla Merian, she's a very famous naturalist. She deserves a lot of recognition. She was an amazing person. But she gives an account of the lanternfly, and this is her illustration of these lanternflies. So these lanternflies supposedly have a hood on their head that gives off light at night. She says that some Indians brought her a bunch of these flies, and she took them and she closed them into a chest that she had. And then when she went to bed that night, she said that she was awoken by a really loud noise that she discovered was coming from the chest. And when she went to open it, she said that she was terrified and quickly closed it again because there came, as it were, a flame of fire as often as a new insect flew out. So this is taken from her image again. And there were accounts of women who worked by these at night. Men traveled by them fastened to their toes at night. They could spin, weave, boil, paint, dance by their light at night. Supposedly the Spaniards read letters by them. But surprisingly, today we know that these give off no light whatsoever, so they don't glow at all. This is completely mythical. One of my very favorites, people were always arguing about which is superior, the nightingale in Europe or the mockingbird in America. A man named Gesner quotes a letter that he says was written by somebody that was a gentleman of veracity. And it says that one night as the gentleman lay awake at an inn, he heard 2 nightingales in cages conversing together about the politics of Europe and kept up a long and interesting dialogue on a variety of subjects. One of those themes that I was most interested in or most focused on as I was creating toys for the Lloyd, who were the people that were really studying and writing about natural history at this time? Men like William Bartram, John James Audubon, Titian Ramsay Peale, and my favorite that I'm going to be talking about, Alexander Wilson. So all of these men, these were all American naturalists that were in the 18th and 19th centuries. They just had a lot of similarities, philosophical, sentimental, and they were artists. Alexander Wilson, his experience with birds actually began by drawing birds. So his book, American Ornithology, it was one that I was just the most enraptured with. I kept coming back to it during my whole time at the Lloyd. I think it has 3 volumes. I read nearly all 3 volumes in their entirety. So this book was the first scientific book on American birds written by an American resident. There had kind of been a stigma that America didn't have the minds or the resources to produce something like this. And this copy that the Lloyd Library has, the originals are illustrated copies. They didn't have the illustrated copy, but they did have this version, which is the first copy that was published in Britain. It had an interesting introduction that really showed how much Alexander Wilson and this ornithology was just revered by the British. So Alexander Wilson didn't have the credentials of what we would consider a scientist today. But like I said, most of the people who were writing about natural history at this time didn't seem to have those credentials. But by the mid-1800s, you really see a lot of sound scientific research starting to emerge. J.G. Woods, this is him. So he's writing in the middle of the 1800s, and he says, "Nowadays, science is so very skillful in her military affairs that she keeps a corps of sharpshooters, and no sooner does a would-be naturalist show his head in the distance than he gets shot through the brain by a horrible bullet of a word that effectually slays the naturalist in him." So this was sort of the beginning of the end of that era of lords and ladies and reverends and just anyone who had a poetic, adventurous spirit and an interest in nature. The study of nature was truly the jurisdiction of scientists. But again, Alexander Wilson came about half a century before this was starting to happen. And he certainly was not a scientist to begin with. Alexander Wilson was a Scotsman. In his country, he was a weaver and a failed satirical poet. I even read that he was briefly imprisoned for his poetry. Eventually, he immigrated to America and became a school teacher. Alexander Wilson was also given to melancholy. That's something I noticed with a lot of these naturalists. His friends started to become really worried about him. They tried to convince him to give up things like poetry and the flute, things that would make him melancholy, and tried to get him to take on some more cheerful pastimes. William Bartram, who I mentioned earlier, was one of his friends and introduced him to drawing birds. And it just clicked immediately. As soon as he started drawing birds, it just took over his life. It wasn't long before he decided he wanted to create an ornithology of North American birds, which was a crazy undertaking, especially for someone like him without very many qualifications. In a letter that he wrote to William Bartram, he pretty much said that his greatest qualifications were that he wasn't married and that he loved adventure. But he did it, and in his travels he discovered 27 new species, and in the next 100 years only 23 more land species would even be discovered in America. So it's really amazing what he did. His book was scientific, but it was mixed with history and personality and culture. It isn't just valuable as a book about birds, but it was really a book about America and about man's relationship to nature at this period in time. I also loved that it was just an unabashedly personal account of nature. His fingerprint was all over it, which is so different from, say, an American ornithology that we would read today. And again, it was just such an amazing undertaking. In the introduction to this book, it says that when this superb volume of American ornithology was presented to the public in Britain, their delight was equaled only by their astonishment that America, as yet in its infancy, should produce an original work in science, which could vie in its essentials with the proudest productions of a similar nature of the European world. And that is the other theme that I saw that I really wanted to focus on for my project with the Lloyd, just this idea of the old world versus the new world. So what the Europeans thought about the Americans, what the Americans were thinking about the Europeans. Again, most of my research was from British books and American books, and each of those countries had something to say about the other. So starting with the French naturalist, the Count de Buffon, the book that he wrote about natural history, which actually contained many, many volumes. In his book, he talks about his theory about the degeneracy of American nature. And that was an idea that carried over in a lot of European nature writing that I read. The Count de Buffon had never actually been to America, but he described it as a country of extremes, extreme heat, extreme cold. And according to Buffon, this climate caused the nature of America to degenerate. So the birds in America were supposedly ugly. They sang ugly songs. Dull birds in America were supposedly just degenerate versions of more colorful birds in Europe. Buffon said that the animals in America were small and stunted. Supposedly, the climate there couldn't support big, robust animals. And at this time, Thomas Jefferson was the ambassador to France, which again, Buffon was a French naturalist. And he actually at one point had dinner with the Count de Buffon. And at this dinner, he says that the Count de Buffon told him that people's accounts of moose were probably people just seeing reindeer and then just blowing it way out of proportion. So Thomas Jefferson, after this, became obsessed with acquiring an American moose that he could send to the Count de Buffon. So he wrote home to everyone he knew. He asked them if you could please taxidermy the biggest moose you can find, send it across the ocean, and he would send it to the Count de Buffon. And someone did finally step up and find him a moose. But by the time the taxidermied specimen had actually made it to Europe, it was a really pitiful sight. So they even had to replace its antlers with deer or elk antlers, and Thomas Jefferson told the Count de Buffon to just imagine them bigger. There was this idea at the time that America was mostly just a swamp and that it had only recently risen up out of the ocean and it was still sort of drying out. It wasn't as hardy or established as continents like Europe. There was also this idea that cultivated nature was superior to wild nature. So in his book, Buffon describes America, and he says that the transpiration of so many vegetables pressed close together produce immense quantities of moist and noxious exhalations. In these melancholy regions, nature remains concealed under her old garments and never exhibits herself in fresh attire. Being neither cherished nor cultivated by man, she never opens her fruitful and beneficent womb. It was this idea that the uncultivated nature in America was unhealthy, noxious. Some European writers who are influenced by Buffon even took his ideas further. There was this author, Abrahnal, in 1770. He wrote that one must be astonished that America has not yet produced one good poet, one able mathematician, one man of genius in a single art or a single science. Other authors were even saying that successive generations would actually degenerate over time. Alexander Wilson and his American Ornithology came about 30 years after these ideas were written. And even 30 years later, he was still combating some of these ideas from Buffon. In his book, there's so many references to Buffon. That's when he usually pulls out his satirical side. At one point, he even says that the writings of Buffon would leave people to wonder if even katydids of America were not originally nightingales of the old world. So eventually these ideas were overcome. A lot of Europeans transitioned from this feeling of contempt and scorn for Americans and for American nature, and they moved into this era of being really enamored with and actually even romanced by the idea of a wild America. Britain at the time was very cultivated. Most of their noxious species, wolves, bears, things like that, had already been completely destroyed. So all of this untouched wilderness in America became a very romantic idea. John James Audubon, when he actually traveled to Britain to try to get people to subscribe to his giant elephant folio about the birds of America, he became like a spectacle. People wanted to see him with his fur cap on. They asked him to imitate wild bird sounds. They wanted to hear his stories. He says in his journal that they appeared surprised that I have no wonderful tales to tell. That, for instance, I have not been devoured at least 6 times by tigers, bears, wolves, foxes. No, I was never troubled by any larger animals than ticks and mosquitoes. This well-bred society of England and what he calls its perfection of manners, it was just something that Audubon had never seen or heard before in America. He also talks about walking with friends just on these English pathways and seeing beech woods off in the distance and just wishing that he could go and walk in the woods. But it's private property and he can't. And he says it's shocking that while in England all is hospitality within, all is so different without. No one dared trespass, as it is called. Signs of large dogs are put up, and even eyes are kept out by high walls. So those were some pretty large differences between America and Britain at the time. So British had farming, but they had a lot of manufacturing, and America at this point was pretty much all farming. The founding fathers, especially Thomas Jefferson, wanted to create what they considered a nation of farmers, a nation built on agriculture. I read in Casson's book of North American Birds, he talks about American children and how just about every American child has a gun. He says that the old adage, learn to speak the truth and swim, should also include to shoot. They say it's a big part of shaping the intellectual character of American children. And now that brings me to the toys that I created for the Lloyd. Like I said earlier, I really like to portray these ideas about natural history with toy-like objects. And I love to do that because toys are whimsical, and whimsy has always been a pretty inherent quality of natural history. You think about the old wonder cameras or curiosity cabinets, just taxidermy in general, or butterfly collections. Old natural history prints oftentimes had a very whimsical quality about them. And toys are a great whimsical medium for storytelling, and you can imply a lot of unsaid information with toys. Supposedly art and beauty are ends in themselves, but toys are not. Toys have been used for millennia. Children have used toys like dolls as empathy test dummies for their interactions with real humans. And toys are what adults give children to kind of train them for life in society. I like the playful idea that my toy objects were kind of created to fulfill a similar function, to train us for our interactions with nature. But when I use the toy form, it also kind of alludes to the negative ways that we sequester nature, and just the way that our human perceptions can create a world of playthings. And as we've seen through history, that sometimes creates very bad results. When it came time to design the toys, I had so many ideas. Like I said, I was just curating facts and kind of putting things together and telling stories in my mind and designing different toys, things like night lights and doll houses, like I said, a welcome choir for the Count de Buffon, a boxing game between the nightingale and the mockingbird. Just lots of fun ideas that hopefully will still be made someday. And the two that I did settle on were starting with the second one, which is this bird carousel that I made. It's called Alexander's Dawn Sonata. So if you see the description of this piece online on my website, I have this description talking about Alexander's American Ornithology that I just really came to love, that book. Here it says, the book epitomizes the Victorian era's constant comparison between the old world, Europe, and the new America. Whether it was America trying to combat Buffon's ideas about the degeneration of New World nature, or Americans poo-pooing the manicured fenced-off state of Old World nature, the debates usually came down to a schoolyard brawl of my nature is prettier than yours, well, my nature could beat your nature up. In one of my favorite examples in his book, Alexander is talking about the cardinal, and he sets aside what he's saying to address the opinion that the American dawn chorus is far inferior to that of Europe, to which he says, could these people be transported to the borders of our woods and settlements in the month of May, about half an hour before sunrise, such a ravishing concert would greet their ear as they have no conception of. This is where Alexander's Dawn Sonata comes from. In paper and wood, I recreated many of the birds that you might find in a dawn chorus in May, and the birds swarm together in a twirling mass, and they sing a dawn chorus that represents a fanciful version of what Alexander might have heard at the turn of the 19th century. So this piece does contain a dawn chorus. To create that dawn chorus, I used the Macaulay Library, which the Macaulay Library, it's a database of wildlife sounds. It's been around since 1929. It's the biggest archive of animal sounds in the world. I was able to go on there and request the song of every bird that was going to be included in the chorus, which there's more than 50. So these are real sounds. All I did was I had to take each song and clean it up so it had a lot of background noise. That took a really long time. I was really trying to stay true to science while adding in the sentimental element. When you hear this dawn chorus, you'll hear that the songs aren't altered in any way. They're just arranged and curated in a very unrealistic way. So these are the same songs that I used to hear when I'd wake up early to hear a dawn chorus, but they become, as you can see here, exploded. So in the beginning, the songs piece together like an undulating, unbroken, angelic melody. It's grandiloquent, kind of like old natural history writing was. Then right on cue, they all join together to create this cacophony that represents a fantastical version of the dawn chorus Alexander might have heard, which I'll be playing it for you here in a minute. Aesthetically, the carousel was also inspired by my research at the Lloyd. It's kind of based on old antique Victorian bird trees and carousels and things, but also the birds themselves, their shape was very purposeful. One of the amazing books that the Lloyd Library has in their collection is Mark Catesby's The Natural History of Carolina. This was the first published account of the flora and fauna of North America. One of his observations about the yellow-breasted chat, he described that the chat was unusual among birds because it flew with this erect posture and its legs hanging down. So most birds, they tuck their legs in. They don't fly with their heads up in this way. This was a mistake. This is just a display flight. They don't actually always fly this way. But I based all of the birds in my carousel on that posture described by Mark Catesby. So all of them have the straight-backed upright posture. And again, trying to be scientific mixed with the sentimental, I tried to create a pretty realistic depiction of these birds, minus that unrealistic folk-like posture. I was also inspired by just the setup of Alexander Wilson's images in his book. When his American Ornithology was being published, they didn't have very much money to fund the project. He didn't have the money to really highlight each bird on its own separate page. So instead you see these birds fitting together, filling the page clear to the margins. So I knew when I was designing something based on Alexander Wilson, I really wanted to create something like this, where all of the birds were fitting together in this sort of unusual conglomeration. And now here's a video of the carousel in action paired with its dawn chorus. I had so much fun making this piece. In my mind, I see it as Wilson throwing down the gauntlet to the Europeans. Oftentimes, old natural history writing was like the proverbial old men sitting on a porch telling yarns, and that's what these toys are. Alexander's Dawn Sonata was a stretched story, and this next one, Alexander's Nocturne, is also a stretched story. This toy relates to the first toy. I wanted both toys to have sound. They're a mix of facts and fiction, science and sentiment. I don't usually create a piece until it takes on a life in my brain. The backstory of these toys, I picture them as pieces in a child's room, maybe an old Victorian child who is obsessed with wild American wilderness, like so many children are obsessed with dinosaurs today. Maybe like a European parent who went to America and brought these as souvenirs back for their children. So in a way, it's America exploiting the European superstitions about America. The sounds for this pillow were inspired by what I read by naturalists who were traveling alone. These are sounds that they described hearing at night. Starting with Alexander Wilson talking about trying to sleep in Indiana when it was still forest and swamp, and being woken up by the scream of a great horned owl that he said strikingly resembles the half-suppressed screams of a person suffocating or throttled. I also read about the unpleasantness of trying to sleep with whippoorwills singing, or the sudden croaking call of a night heron in the night. There were a lot of superstitions about that. Or William Bartram talks about the terrifying sounds of American alligators growling at night during his travels in Florida. Also the shrieking, hacking sounds of the mountain lion. Again, I combed through the Macaulay Library's database and found those sounds. I requested to use them, and then cleaned them up, layered them together like I did with Alexander's Dawn Sonata, and then put them in this pillow. So this pillow has a sound mechanism inside. When you lay down on it, it plays a fantastically horrifying rendition of American nature at night that was meant to satisfy all of the British cravings for stories about a wild America. You know, all the stories that they wish they could have heard about from Audubon instead of stories about mosquitoes and ticks. So I'll play this for you now. Again, all of the sounds in these two pieces are real and unaltered. They're just cleaned up, their volumes changed, and they're layered and arranged. So here is Alexander's Nocturne. So Alexander's Dawn Sonata was based on this idea of America versus Britain, and now this toy object is based on Britain's obsession with America as a romantic idea. Stylistically, the print that I designed for this pillow was based on the paper cutouts that you would find in Pennsylvania and areas like that at this time, sort of the folk art of America, being brought to civilized Europe as a souvenir. But both of these toys, even though they're based on Victorian ideas and motifs, but they're only quasi-Victorian. Obviously, they're mixed with modern motifs, electric apparatus, and sound. You know, ultimately, these are meant to make us think about our modern ideas about nature. I said earlier that Alexander's Dawn Sonata represented him throwing down the gauntlet to the Europeans, but last year scientists announced that birds in the US have decreased 29% since 1970. So when I made this piece, I really saw it as sort of Alexander Wilson throwing down the gauntlet to all of us. With such a rapid decrease in bird numbers, none of us really have any conception of the dawn chorus Alexander might have heard. Old natural history accounts like Alexander Wilson's are so important. They help prevent us from communally, forgetting what the natural world was like. They prevent us from thinking that the present state of things, the status quo, is normal or acceptable. And in conclusion, I just want to thank the Lloyd Library. This was such a wonderful experience for me. I can't think of a better place to have done this research. The Lloyd Library is in Cincinnati, and Cincinnati sits on the Ohio River, and the Ohio River was really the highway of exploration at this time. This is the route explorers took west. This is where Lewis and Clark took off, where Alexander Wilson, William Bartram, John James Audubon did a lot of their research for these books. This is where a lot of the huge flocks of passenger passenger pigeons were sighted. Within miles of the Lloyd Library is the location where Alexander Wilson saw his biggest flock of Carolina parakeets that he said just carpeted the ground in green and yellow. The Lloyd Library is such an asset. It's a place where we can go and just see how the natural world was, how it used to look, the ideas that we used to have about it. And I firmly believe that knowing those things will help us better understand our ideas today. It will have a big effect on the facts that we choose to curate, the stories that we choose to tell, and in turn, how we choose to protect the natural world.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for watching that. If you guys happen to have any questions now, feel free to plug those into the chat. I would be happy to answer those. While you're doing that, Anna, I saw that you said that your kids came running to hear the bird sounds. I'm glad. I hope that when the next toy played, I hope those scary sounds didn't frighten them too much. Oh, so you said they liked those sounds too. Good, I'm glad. Okay, so Ronald asked what birds from the books I would most like to have seen. So that's a good question. I won't just say all of them, even though it's true. So I love birds. Birding and birds are a huge part of my life, even outside of art. But there are some birds that were mentioned in those books, particularly there's a vulture that was mentioned by William Bartram and some other authors that supposedly used to live in America that nobody can account for. It was a giant vulture that just in history, we have no idea what it was, what they're talking about, but there's enough accounts of it that it must have actually existed. And I would love to have seen what that was. So that's one of them. Mary Jo asked if I study any bird skins. So yes, I do. That's most of my art outside of these toys that you've seen have been paintings, and most of them are actually ornithological bird skins. So I work a lot with museums to work in their research collections. So that's my other love too, is research collections, museums, bird skins. Let's see. I was asking if this would be recorded. It will be online. Oh, somebody asked me, what is your favorite bird? So that's another tough one. I don't know that I could possibly say, but one of my favorite birds are nighthawks, which that's one that didn't show up in my night noise toy. It could have, but their sounds, they come out in the evening time, and their sounds, it's like a peent sound that is just one of my favorites growing up. It just has a lot of ambiance for me. So I love that one. Question about the rhinoceros print. It looks like it was from Durr, and that's true. It was. So that print in there, that was, I think, that was what they used as the scientific depiction of a rhinoceros for something like 500 years, which it was a pretty good job, but there are a lot of inaccuracies in it, and you can just see it just by looking at it. But that was Durr, so that's another just kind of recycled image that you saw in a lot of old books. I have people asking what I'm working on now in Idaho. So right now I've been working on some paintings and things. I keep sketching ideas for toys. I have some ideas for some bird dolls that are actually more doll-like than my other bird dolls that I would like to be working on. Some American dolls that are holding British bird dolls is my plan. And there's some concepts and things that go with that, but lots of fun ideas. Again, stuff that I learned from the Lloyd is going to be making its way into my work for a long time. Yeah, here Marissa said that I mentioned research and writing. When do I feel like I'm ready to create a visual? That's a good question. So I'm definitely, artists are all different. I'm definitely one of those artists where I do tons of research beforehand. I think a lot and I make lots of sketches and notes. And then when something finally clicks, when two ideas that I'm kind of curating and putting together seem like they're telling an interesting story and I just can't get it out of my mind, then that's when I make those. And that's how it was for these toys, just picturing children playing with these, the British people who were maybe purchasing these for their kids, just how it lived in the children's rooms, things like that. Just it comes to life in my mind. And then I just really want this thing to exist in real life. And that's usually when I get started. Another question, how do you think man's relationship to nature has changed today compared to what I was seeing in history? So that's a good question. I'm not in any way, I'm not pretending to be a scientist or a historian. So I am definitely an artist. I'm looking at these things very holistically. But something that I've noticed from old writing, science is definitely becoming more objective today, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There are very good reasons why it has for a lot of the examples that I was telling in this, all the misinformation and things that were coming about. But something that's interesting that's happening today is with the internet and this new platform that we have, amateur naturalists are able to share their voice again and their viewpoints of nature. And so it'll be really interesting to see how it starts to change the stories that we're telling about nature and how our viewpoints change over time. So I'm not a historian. I don't really know what that's going to create in the future, but it's really interesting to me. That's another thing that I'd like to research, is kind of tie together what I was researching at the Lloyd with modern times by really looking into the 1900s next, is something I would love to do. So what I think that studying nature in the past can teach us in this age of climate change and mass extinction. So that's a really good question. I think one thing that I have learned is that we are, as humans, we are very fallible. A lot of the things that we think that we know right now, in 20 years, we are going to find out is not necessarily true. So just being very open-minded and being willing to just kind of look at the big picture is very important. That's something that I saw with this project, and definitely learning to look at the past and, like I said, see how things were and let that help us decide how we want things to be in the future. So the way that things are now, or even have been for as long as we can remember in our lifetimes, are not the way that they always were. And so learning about those things and trying to kind of build that desire in people to reestablish nature and save and protect nature and bring it back to the way that it was is really important. That's one of my just pet passion projects in life. So, all right, some other questions. Songbirds as food. People never thought about that. Was that just an American custom? So that wasn't. I think that was all over the world. A lot of these books that I was reading were British, and they were all talking about the taste of birds and things. So that was definitely a shared thing. So I have here someone asks, in some of your paintings, the pose in which you portray the birds is very particular, like still life specimens. Is this actually related to your work in archives or based on any other particular choice? So that's something that you will see in my work, even my paintings and things. I love the still, obviously manipulated poses of birds, something that shows that it's something that was removed from life. Sometimes I say humans are kind of like the stage hands of my images. The things that I paint had to have been arranged by people. People had to have come in contact with these things at some point. And so those are usually the things that I am drawn to. So not just nature, but ideas about nature and things. I was asked if any children have played with my toys. They have not because I wouldn't want them to. I just haven't had a chance for them to play with them yet. But that would be an interesting thing to do in the future, is create toys that children actually could play with. And it is interesting, you asked if I've noticed anything about how children use them. I would really be interested in seeing, looking into that, just seeing, their reactions to my toys. That's a great idea. Let's see, Will asked, it seems like there's been a long transition away from a deep connection to the natural world. Was there a major event that caused a shift away from an intimate relationship with nature, such as World War I and the Mercy Club? So that's a really good question. That's something that I have been researching. Like I mentioned in there, there was kind of that time period of bands of mercy, this time where people were really into this sympathetic view of nature, kind of seeing animals and creatures as neighbors and friends and things like that. And World War I really changed that. World War II especially changed that. But then even after that, I was reading, the Red Scare and the space race. Once school started focusing more on mathematics and science, it kind of started to just wane naturally. And then also, like I was saying, science, it was starting to become a much kind of a firmer discipline, the study of nature. And so it was definitely scientists who were doing the research, and there was a big push to make things objective, which was a good reason. But so it kind of started to disconnect everyday people some from the study of nature at that point. And that's something that's starting to change now. People are seeing that that's been a problem. But yeah, definitely, there's been a lot of things that have caused that over time. See if I missed any other questions. I think that I got them all. Yeah, I think that's everything. So thank you all again for coming. This was a really wonderful experience for me. I love that I had this chance to share this with you guys. Share this with everyone, sorry.
And thank you so much, Shae, and for the audience, thank you for attending. A couple of people have asked this, but our recorded lectures usually appear on our YouTube channel a few days after the live presentation. And to learn more about upcoming events, our collections and services, or how to become a member and support programs like this, visit our website at www.lloydlibrary.org or follow us on social media. Thank you and have a great evening.